we consider this very timely because of the weather, and because of climate change, calamities are occurring with devastating frequency. So the big question, sir, is are we prepared for the next big one? But before we get into that, let's talk about the NDRRMC. What are its functions? We've seen a series of natural calamities in the past, and we've seen different government agencies do their thing, no? Pero where does your office get into the picture?
If we're going to talk about the council, it's basically as the name implies, it's a council composed of the different government agencies, and not only government agencies. It has a membership of about 44 members in the council, and most of these are the line agencies of the government. And added to that, we have memberships, 4 from the civil society organizations, and other groups which are represented in the council. The council basically is the primary entity that governs our policies and the coordination and the implementation of our National Disaster Risk Reduction Program. This was created under the Republic Act 10121, which is the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Law, and on the basis of that, as you would see, and you were correct, it's composed of the different agencies who are actually the ones implementing the policies, the doctrines, and the different programs of the council towards the states' programs relative to disaster risk reduction.
Okay, mga kaibigan, pinag-uusapan po natin ang kahandaan natin sa mga natural calamities. Itong mga bagyo, bulkan, mga earthquake na alam naman natin dito sa Pilipinas hindi tayo nagkukulang diyan. Anyway, kasama po natin si Undersecretary Alex Pama. Siya po ang Executive Director of the NDRRMC. Medyo tongue twister.
It is.
Anyway, palagi ko very relevant ito. So kung meron kayong katanungan tungkol sa kahandaan ng inyong pamayanan, inyong barangay sa mga ganito mga pangyayari, at yung mga maaaring mangyari pa sa future, the number to text is 0915-209-6012. Paki-text lang ho yung inyong first name and where you're from so that we can gauge our reach. Anyway, sir, itong NDRRMC, kasi sa Estados Unidos, meron silang tinatawag na FEMA, yung Federal Emergency Management Agency. So, ibig sabihin, sa kanila, pagkakaintindi ko, pag nagkaroon ng malawakang sakuna, itong disaster sa isang lugar, ang ginagawa itong FEMA steps in and it becomes sort of like the ruler over that crisis area. It takes over the police, it takes over the National Guard, it takes over yung hospitals, rescue. So para magkaroon ng, in effect, binibigyan mo ng parang emergency powers para for 2 or 3 days lang kung kailan may disaster, isa lang namumuno para isa lang nasusunod. Dahil sometimes you need that sort of system in a catastrophe. So is that what
the main difference we have is tama yun, the United States has this FEMA. In our case, it is the council, However,
so collegial body pa rin.
Yeah, it's a collective body. However, it's also quite clear in the law, and even with what we're doing, we're starting to do right now, enforcing it. Aside from the fact that the council is the coordinating body, during times of calamities and disasters, it is the body now who's calling the shots relative to the implementation. The way it works kasi is ganito Under the law, meron tayong tinatawag na 4 na thematic areas. And the way we'll, unlike FEMA, that is more on the response side after the incident has happened, yung sa atin, itong by virtue of 10121 Republic Act, the way we approach it is we are looking at it not only during the crisis, but we instead, what we are doing is we have the 4 thematic areas na tinatawag. And that includes the first thematic area, yung prevention, what we call the 2 P's and 2 R's. We have the prevention and mitigation, and then the next thematic area is the preparedness, and then the next thematic area is the response, and then yung rehabilitation and recovery. So sa aspeto na yan, in all these thematic areas, NDCC pa rin ho ang parang governing body with all this. It's the only difference is that in these thematic areas, merong lead agency. Like in the preparedness and mitigation, DOST po nagli-lead yan. Kaya nandyan po yung Pag-asa, nandyan po yung ating mga FIVOLCS, yung to include yung Mines and Geosciences Bureau for the hazard areas. And then the next is the preparedness. This is headed or led by the DILG. And then we have the response after the hazard has happened. Response. This is headed by the DSWD.
Okay, social welfare.
Social welfare.
So,
And
so
then-
you don't actually assume, dictatorial powers over a crisis area for so long? Or,
Well, for one, we're in a democracy. We don't have dictatorial things. But,
Pero shouldn't we have that power? I
No,
mean, for maybe
actually-
2 or 3 or 4 days lang naman.
No, actually, to a certain extent, the NDRRMC has that powers. That's being exercised by the chairman, which is the Secretary of National Defense, in times of, in fact, even before. Now we have the system that we call the PDRA. We did the pre-disaster risk assessment. Ibig sabihin po nito, like for example, may namataan na tayong hazard, which is way outside the Philippine area of responsibility. There, it kicks in already. The process kicks in. Pinapatawag na po natin yung core group na itong mga members ng thematic areas, and the DOST now makes the forecast based on scientific studies that the NOAA kicks in, the Pag-asa comes in.
So it's a system. It's
a system.
Okay.
It's now a system.
Okay.
And in the whole process of the system, it's the NDRRMC now who takes the lead in this. So practically, I wouldn't call it dictatorial, but the supervisory function is there, the coordinative function is there, and very clear naman in certain.
And you can mobilize the AFP,
Oh,
the
yes.
PNP,
Oh, yes.
because these are your first responders.
Yes,
no? They do the rescue. They have the boats, they have
Yes,
the choppers,
correct.
and they have the manpower.
Correct.
Yun ang,
In
okay.
fact, the NDRRMC is empowered by law to call on any government agency during the times of calamities and hazards to utilize whatever resources they have for purposes of addressing the needs.
Anyway, before we go further, congratulations on your handling of Typhoon Glenda. No? I think everyone agrees that, government or the country was as prepared as it can be. No, you cannot be 100% prepared for any sort of calamity. But I guess we were relatively prepared.
Well, thank you very much. If that is the perception we're getting, I think it's not. It's collective. It's a collective act, and I think your statement basically proves that the system works. There is the system now that we're trying to do, and we're not saying it's a perfect system. It's a work in progress. We're doing a lot of fine-tuning to that, but I think there's a marked difference now in how we were doing it and how we're approaching in a very systematic way.
But in a span of less than 1 year, I mean, the immediate response, at least for the first 2 or 3 days after Yolanda, there was I mean, we were everyone was covering that event, and there was a perception that not enough was done. Was the NDRRMC involved in that? Because I think it was the DILG who was calling the shots, which is why it took the flak.
Yeah. Again, I may go back to dun sa four thematic areas natin. No? The preparedness aspect, as you were saying, is a part of the DILG. It's not. If truth be told, in fairness to DILG, I think there was no lack on their part in implementing the things and the protocols and the things that needed to be done. If at all, I will not even say blame. If at all, I think the area that we need to improve a lot more will be on the aspect of the information and education directly to our people. After Glenda, we did what you would call the disaster forensics. We analyzed the statistics, and we also tried to correlate this with a lot of subjective inputs on what happened on the ground itself. And it seems like, if you notice, if you look at this, the number of casualties, most of the casualties were caused by either falling trees, hit by flying debris, and all those stuff, which simply shows
That was the immediate. No?
yeah,
That
at
was
the
the
time the hazard was happening, some of our people are still in areas which were not considered to be safe. They were not in safe areas. But again, in fairness to DILG, I was personal witness on how our DILG representatives in the NDRRMC at that time were practically burning the lines, calling the area specific areas where the typhoon was going to pass through.
Pero ito sir, tatanungin ko sa inyo, was it a learning experience? Ibig sabihin, are we a little bit smarter after that? Because obviously, you said it's not a perfect system and its imperfections were really glaring at the time. No? I guess it has a tendency to get into the spotlight, the problems in the system. But have we learned from that and have we remedied whatever weak link there was?
Yeah, to a certain extent, I think it's a natural thing that every experience is a learning process, and that's one of the things that we do right now, insofar as this core group of the PDRA is concerned. That in every, like, not only in Glenda but even in the other typhoons that did not hit land, from at least from the time I got into the OCD and the NDRRMC. We leverage on the good practices, like for example what the things that Albay did, because they had zero casualty.
Yes.
And then we try to analyze where the shortcomings were or the gaps maybe in the implementation in areas like the Calabar zone, which if you're going to look at it, the Calabar zone recorded the most number of casualties.
So when there is no typhoon or no disaster taking place, you guys still work on perfecting the craft, looking at the flaws in the system.
Sabi nga, walang pahinga dyan kasi kung wala naman tayong typhoon, the lessons learned in the previous experiences, we try to fine-tune either the SOPs or yung ating pong mga protocols. That's being perfected now. Like recently, we just came up with the at least led by the DSWD. They came up with the National Disaster Response Plan, and on the basis of actually set na yung plano but we had to more or less fine-tune it on the basis of the experiences we had on Glenda and the other experiences we had previously, of course, to include Yolanda. So these are the things that it's an ongoing process.
So I think there's a brewing storm, no? So ano ba ang latest diyan, no? So sasamantalain na namin yung pagkakataon para makibalita sa inyo. Ano ba ang
right now we are watching one somewhere in the Pacific. It's still not yet in the area of the Philippine area of responsibility. But again, just to show you, kahit nasa labas pa ng PAR natin, tinututukan na ho yan ng ating pag-asa, ng NOAA, and they're doing some simulations to include the track na tinitingnan natin, because once more or less that we see that the track is going to more or less have the path crossing the land areas of the Philippines, that's where we start already planning. Because in the meantime, kasing sistema po natin, depending on the forecast, depending on the way we look at it, we now, with the PDRA, we have such a thing as the way we treat hazards now is hazard specific, area focused, and time bound. Ibig sabihin, when we look at the impact and the risk factor of the hazard that comes in, we are not just considering the gaya dati na signal number 1, number 2, number 3 lang. And then it's across the board.
Iba na ngayon
Iba na ngayon.
When I was a kid, parang masaya pa ako pag magsisignal number 2 dahil walang pasok.
Correct.
Pero ngayon, yung nakikita natin na pagsusungit ng panahon, parang nakakatakot na.
Tama yan. Iba na yung panahon ngayon, kaya iba na rin yung sistema.
It was more, there were a lot of storms then, and it occurred at certain frequencies, pero hindi ganito hindi freak.
Hindi. Tsaka sometimes masasabi nga unpredictable.
Predictable, yes.
In fact, lesson learned dati sa Glenda yan. If you notice, when we started monitoring and preparing for Glenda, the initial preparation we were having was, it was going to hit somewhere in Aurora, Quezon. So ang preparations natin doon, of course with warnings on other areas, but on a day-to-day basis, nagpapalit yung direction niya eh. So we make certain adjustments. DILG now calls, let's say, from Central Luzon, they start mobilizing NCR and Southern Luzon, and then eventually when it hit land, the first land fall was somewhere in Bicol, which is Catanduanes and Northern Samar. So we are flexible. Unlike before, sabihin lang signal number 1, pero ang sunod is, ano ngayon kung signal number 1, di ba?
Baliwala.
Baliwala. So when we look at the impact and the risk factor, like for example, a signal number 1 or a signal number 2 hitting a rural area, for example, like somewhere in Aurora, does not have the same of impact as compared to signal number 2 hitting Metro Manila. Kasi mas prepared eh. Tinitingnan natin yung vulnerability ng areas na to. We are following some sort of a formula like the risk factor is equal to the exposure, the hazard itself, and then the vulnerability.
Okay.
So, pag mas mataas, iba yung preparasyon.
For the Filipino households, sir, what does that mean? I mean, your preparations, how does it translate to them? Is the government now more accessible? Like, pagpalagay natin, taga Quezon City ka, biglang tumataas yung tubig kung saan, dun sa may creek nyo. Can you call the NDRRMC?
Yes.
So meron na rin
Meron
kayo.
ganyan. May sistema.
So interactive na rin kayo.
Interactive. For one, sabi ko nga, yung DILG natin is on the ball on that. Because as the scenario changes, kino-coordinate na nila kaagad on the local government units. And the local government units, if I'm not mistaken, meron na sila mga hazard maps. Nabigyan na ng hazard maps. So, in principle, at dapat ginagawa na rin ng mga local governments natin, pag sinabi sa kanila, okay, in your area, based on the simulations na ginagawa ng Pag-asa and ng NOAA, ang prediction dito is malakas yung ulan dyan. So, you either prepare for flooding or landslides. And we go as specific as that.
Pero dati nung sa NDCC before, hindi ganyan ka.
Not that as far as I can remember.
So there are improvements in the
definitely, definitely.
Kaninong brainchild to? Ito ba sa inyo, sir, or is it?
Actually, if you look at Republic Act
DOST, dahil sa kanila
101, actually nandyan na rin ho yung mga sistema na yan. It's a matter of now implementing it. And maybe the one of the aspects there is talagang specifying and the assertiveness of the council now, given the experiences we've had in the past few years. And maybe I'm just lucky enough that I was given the complete support and confidence by the President and the Secretary of National Defense. And of course, the cooperation of the other agencies made the biggest factor.
Okay. Sir, kung pag-uusapan natin lahat ng mga topics that are important or that are interesting or that are relevant in view of this, medyo gahol na tayo sa panahon dahil nga sa pagsusunod ng panahon.
This is not going to be the last time,
But
I'm sure.
Okay. I hope so. This is the first time. Pero siguro, sana naman wag mangyari, no? Pero if experience is any indication, this sort of thing is bound to happen. Ang question na lang, tayo ba ay magiging handa when it happens or relatively handa when it happens o hindi. So sir, yung inyong parting shot sa ating mga viewers na baka naman perhaps to give them a little sounder night's sleep when catastrophes or when the typhoons hit.
Well, one thing we can assure the public is that one, the government through the NDRRMC is practically leaving no stone unturned, ika nga, for us to be able to address our national disaster risk reduction. And in so far as maybe what we can ask from our populace is kung pwede po na we cooperate. Sabi nga, most if not all disasters are local. And at the end of the day, kahit gaano po kaganda yung sistema natin, kahit gaano po ka preparado yung ating pamahalaan, at the end of the day, yung mga kababayan din po natin ang magde-determine kung tayo ay talagang handa o hindi. Because ang parati namin hinihingi sa ating mga kababayan is the full cooperation na pag kunyari po sa mga kanayunan natin, and even dito sa syudad, pag sinabi po ng ating mga nakakataas, yung ating mga barangay captain, at the level of the community, na pag sinabi ko nyari mag-evacuate, ay kung pwede sundin na po natin because may
Huwag
basehan
antayin.
po yan.
Okay.
Huwag nang hintayin na nandyan na, ito po, naging karanasan natin sa Glenda.
At nasa first floor na yung tubig nyo.